if I was to just go through my slides, it would be just short and not as interesting. So feel free to interrupt, at any point in time. I'll try to manage the discussion. I do have some things to say, and I feel like before I start, I feel like I have to run off and lawyer up as an editor, and also as an editor of one of APA's largest journals. I hope I can also provide perspective that's a little different from the APS journal and others. But the perspectives I'm gonna share are primarily around. So I'm gonna sort of play that from multiple perspectives, not just as an author, as a scholar, as an editor, reviewer as well. But I'm going to try to basically get into some evidence in terms of what I believe is sort of strong evidence versus some doubtful evidence. So it may not be, I think that the important issues of replication and replicability, sorry, I'm running ahead. I think we need to approach it like scientists, in the sense that just because somebody has published something suggests we don't do science right doesn't mean we should accept it at face value. And yet there is evidence that suggests we do have some issues that we need to address. So I don't subscribe to one position or another. I just think that we need to think about it and self-improve the science as we go forward. So that's the kind of perspective I'm going to be taking. I'll talk a little bit about replication, a little bit about reproducibility, where just so we're on the same page, replication is really about somebody has done a study, and then you conduct another study to try to see if you come up with similar results. Reproducibility is somebody has done a study, you basically verify the results. So that's, people can, define this differently, but just want to say that before we get going, particularly because we have different sub-discipline of management here, so I want to make sure we're on the same page. And I'll spend some of the time talking about the evidence and looking at it with a critical eye, if you will. And then I'll also try to think of solutions for how we may improve the way we do science. Some of those solutions I think are already in place. Others are still a work in progress. And I should mention up front that you hear the term crisis, the reproducibility, replication crisis, scientific crisis. I think the fact that we're having these discussions, both in the literature, in conferences, elsewhere, I think for me that's an indication we don't have a crisis. We are actively engaging in self-improving and self-correcting the way we do science, and that's a positive thing. Doesn't mean that our science is perfect, but I'm not one to subscribe that we have a crisis. So I'll say that up front, but you'll see that I will share some evidence suggesting different opinions on that. So let me start with Nosek. It came, I don't know if that Nosek article is going to come now with 3 for 3 in terms of summarizing it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I think both Joe and Rich talked about it a little bit. What I would add to the conversation is the fact that this article is not without criticism, and Joe and others, have published their own opinion on it, and he mentioned maybe 25% versus, so even if we are 75% successful, that still could be a problem. Well, depend how you look at it. I want to highlight one comment on the article by Gilbert et al. That noted some noteworthy problems with the Nosek article. For example, trying to replicate a study of American stereotypes of African American using Italian sample. Now there's a rebuttal, a reply to the comment that also try to defend some of these. But there's been some problem with Nosek article. Other things that I would mention that haven't been discussed. There is something to be said about the way they did that study. I mean, they basically have, they basically supported graduate students and scholars to try to engage in this effort. There's some issues of conflict of interest that could be there. I should also mention that this is not the only effort for replication. There's many lab studies. There's multiple efforts like that. Social psychology, the Journal of Psychology actually had, I think they looked at like 10 very, to reach his earlier point, they looked at 10 classic findings in social psychology, and they were actually able to replicate it pretty well with much higher percentage. So there's mixed evidence out there in terms of the replication issue. I don't doubt that everything, I don't think everything replicates, but I think that my own sense is that Nosek's article is a little overly pessimistic, and they have a shtick. They have sort of, they wanted to prove something, and I think we need to look at it a little critically. All right, so, and feel free to interrupt and jump in, okay? Otherwise I'll kind of go forward, and if you don't jump in, I have some places where I'll ask you for questions. Yes, Jeff. Here. There you go. All right, Jeff.
I maybe should know the answer to this, but were the studies that were in the Nosek paper randomly selected to be replicated, or were they ones where I find this hard to believe, I'm going to see if I can replicate them?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't read it carefully enough. There's a lot of issues, in my opinion, when you look at it. For example, I know one scholar in management that was one of the people involved, and that person tried to replicate something in learning and memory. And he's not a psychologist. He's not an expert in that area. For me, somebody coming from different field try to replicate us, there's some issues there. You know what I mean? But like I said, it's a good effort. It steered the pot. It's a good way to kind of go about it. But there's criticism of it, and there are other aspects out there. The other thing I would mention about Nosek is that one thing that does bother me a little bit is that you see a lot of articles in our field that the beginning couple of pages would be, we have a crisis, and it would cite this as a word of God. Like this is like, it's well known, it's been publicized, and we have an issue. And I think it's important for us to look at it with a critical eye. That's my only point. Okay?
One-handed, yeah. No, I think it comes back to, with replications, again, some of the things that we saw when we did it in SMJ, there's almost the opposite of p-hacking going on, and that the sexy replications don't replicate. And to find something that's there and sort of do the same thing and find it, that's a little less fun, it seems, to people. And so they almost go out of their way in interpretation.
The sexy replication, the original studies are sexy.
The sexy replication, cast doubt on the original study. To actually go to the original study and find it with all that effort and that.
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to some issues that may shed more light on that. So let me move forward. So one, So Scott Maxwell and his colleague, these are just two articles that I really like the way he approaches this topic, because he looks at the question of what replication is very, very thoughtfully, in my opinion. So this is just a couple of studies, one in American Psychologist, where you're basically saying, look, what are we looking for when we're trying to replicate? So if Steve does a study and find that the relationship between X and Y is 0.5, and then Paul goes and does a study and he finds 0.49. Is that a replication? Or if the effect size is 0.2 in one study and versus D of 0.2 versus D of 0.5, what is a replication? And if and then in a follow-up psych method article, Anderson and Maxwell basically said, there are multiple criteria we could apply there, okay? From confidence interval, overlapping, et cetera, et cetera. So, and given just what we know about sampling error and distributions of effects, it's not that simple to even know what replicates and what not. So that's all I want to say about that. Is, you can read the article and there's more in there, but it's not that easy to replicate to begin with. So even the benchmark for replication is high, and that's one of the message. And then there are multiple ways of looking at it. Okay. So that's Maxwell's article. Now, the other point I want to say about replication is that it's not an equal playing field for different subdisciplines of psychology in this case, and I would argue even within management, some things are more easily replicable than others. So for example, in this study, Mitchell, it was actually published in a Perspective of Psychological Science, 2012, and what they did is they basically correlated lab research, effect size in a lab to similar effect sizes or correlations in the field. And I'm not just showing it because I'm an IO psychologist and it shows really well here. But you see variety here. You see social psychology, is not doing as well as IO. That negative relationship with developmental is bizarre to me. I don't know how they came up with a negative relationship. In other words, the more likely you are to find a positive effect in a lab, the less likely you are to. I don't know how they found that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that distinction. Now, it was mentioned earlier about APA versus APS. So APA actually started, a few journals started doing those replication sections. It's online only. So JPSP is doing it, and Journal of Experimental Psych General started doing it. And in JEP General, they actually, I think that they quasi-require pre-registration to do replications. And if you go and look at that, I haven't done it for a year, but I've looked at the first year or two when they've done it, they actually found that a lot of that research didn't replicate. Now, to your question, Miles, right? Is it because we select studies that we think are not going to replicate and then find it, or is it not? But I think the other lesson from this is one of the reasons I think that in IO psychology and OBGYR, a lot of our studies may be more replicable is that the construct validity of the studies is higher. So we're not just going after internal validity and other aspects of validity, but the aspects of construct validity that is higher. If you look at the original Cook and Campbell defined construct validity differently than the Shadish Cook and Campbell, the new version. One of the new aspects that they added is that part of construct validity is the mimicking of the real phenomena. So it's almost like leaping into external validity. And I think that if you compare the kind of research we do with the phenomena in mind, it's more likely that you capture it in a way that other people can pick it up and mimic it. Whereas in more basic aspect of psychology, it may be that it's harder to mimic it because the construct validity of the original studies are lower. Okay? Because you kind of have to make some conceptual leap into the phenomena. The phenomena is not as easily found, or because of other factor. Maybe like in JPSP, for example, which is sort of the holy grail of social psychology in a way. They emphasize internal validity above all else, and I think that what's one of the costs maybe in that field is that you don't pay enough attention to capturing the phenomena carefully. So that's one of my own inferences. I don't have anything to back it up except reading thousands of papers in our field and seeing how important that is. But I think that's one of the issues. I'm happy to hear other thoughts on this. But any other thoughts on that idea? All right. It's either overly controversial or not controversial enough, so I'll move on. So let me move to the journal side. So this is an article from the centennial issue of JP last year, and Cortina, Guinness, and Dishan, they, after much toning down in the process, still said that there's a problem in our journals in a sense that we look too much for novel things and we underemphasize rigor in terms of like replicability and so forth. Well, I think that they're partially right. Okay? And sorry, Jason, for throwing AMJ. And I know that AMJ has a broader mission statement that talks about the fact that theory testing can be a contribution. And yet, those of you who publish a lot and review a lot for AMJ know that a lot of the reviewers emphasize theoretical boldness and novelty above other things. And it's not just AMJ. At JP, I work really, really hard with the AEs, particularly to try to make sure that we realize there are different kind of contribution that could be on equal grounding. Okay? So testing a theory that's never been tested can be a really important contribution. And yet, if you want to be theoretically bold for one reason or another, we sometimes confuse it. And it's not just AMJ, it's JP, other journals. Sometimes reviewers view it as a lesser contribution. So that's a case where I would argue that journals can play a role in terms of appreciating multiple kind of contribution and the fact that replication, particularly constructive replication, can be quite beneficial. Let me give some example of constructive replication at JP. So, and you can find other journals for these as well. So the first paper has, in my opinion, has absolutely zero theoretical contribution in terms of novelty. And yet it's really important. What they did is they basically came up with a 3-hour workshop of manipulating goal orientation. And in 3 hours, they were able to basically increase substantially the chances of reemployment of Dutch unemployed at the time. Now, it also hit in the right timing because it was right as the Great Recession was setting stage and so forth. So that's an example of a constructive replication, right? You kind of show the generalizability of the phenomena that we already know, or theory that we already know. It's not theoretically bold, it's practically bold. Okay, so again, an example of that. Schmidt and Deschamps, sorry, Jeff. They kind of qualified some of Jeff's findings, right? They basically showed that Jeff is right in terms of self-efficacy negatively predicts performance when the task is, or performance is ambiguous, but it positively relates to subsequent performance when performance is unambiguous. Okay? So they kind of qualified that debate between Vancouver's work and Bandura and Luck, right? That's sort of a constructive replication. It shows when an effect replicates, when it doesn't. Okay? And then Schultz et al., they basically had direct replication that failed to replicate of a classic escalation of commitment finding. They basically showed that no, it's not what we thought. It's not that we escalate commitment because we search for biased information. And the reason that it's not the search for biased information is, I think it's because it's too obvious for others and you try to appear fair. But it's more implicitly based. It's how we evaluate information, which is more affected by implicit biases that we don't control. So they failed to replicate in a couple of studies, and then in a couple of other studies showed that it's an alternative mechanism. So these are just some examples of how we can do replication in a constructive way in our field. And I think those are really well, at least some of these are well cited. The Schmidt and Deschamps one, I think, gets quite a bit citation because of the contribution they made. It was just a research report at JP that were able to basically do some of that. So anyway, so just to kind of summarize my thought of replication. There's certainly examples of findings that don't replicate, and I think that the previous two, I think Joe, you highlight some that didn't replicate, like the power pose and others. There's certainly examples in the literature of things that don't replicate, but there's likely variance across different phenomena, different subdisciplines that we need to take into account. That's one of the points. Now, in terms of top-down and bottom-up influences, so you do as an editor, even though I'm not lawyered up like Rich suggested, you do hear a lot of criticism. You should do this, you should do that, you should do this. I do think that we could do some things as journal editors and journals in a policy to affect things. But there is no one simple solution there. For example, if I was to write an editorial that you should submit replication studies, it doesn't mean that reviewers are going to agree with it. It doesn't mean that we're going to see more. And the thing is, though, there are people who argue that we don't publish replications. That's just not true. I gave 3 examples. I can give more. There are quite a few. We don't always call it replication, but there's reason why we can do meta-analysis. The fact that there are different variation of it. The other thing I would mention, and that's sort of that also about the 3-way interaction, is that it's harder to do direct replication in more applied in the more applied aspects of our science. So our science has more basic all the way to applied kind of continuum. So to your question earlier about how do you do a replication like that? Well, if I do a big study on expatriates, I did this study on newcomers expats. Okay, so we looked at I don't know 70 expatriates as they joined the assignment over time. Okay, in one large oil and gas company. What would be a direct replication of it? I don't know. I don't know how you can directly replicate it. So that's a complexity that is very hard to deal with. And then there's those more complex kind of effects, right? So very few studies in our field now are just about bivariate relationship. Typically, you see some mediation, moderation, those complexities. It's very, very hard to replicate that. It's very hard to find those things. But you do see, so in terms of editorial policy, it's not editorial policy, but I do see reviewers and editors asking for, hey, that's a really nice three-way interaction. Can you replicate it? Or at least explain it theoretically. So you do see a little bit of a push in terms of trying to, of demanding more from those complex findings. But I also think that replication is tougher when it's more complex phenomena than it's simpler phenomena. Okay? Yeah, so that's all I have. Yeah, questions?
It's an easy catch. Hey, so one thing I'm thinking about this is, well, our field does have this culture of origination bias, right? So whenever you publish a study, you supported something, then that study is held as the golden standard. You kind of put it on the pedestal, right? So anyone who, even it's a very cool question, like it's actually very worth of re-exploring. And anyone's gonna try to do a new study or replication on it, they are hold against to the old finding. You have to say why your new finding, like first of all, why your study is better, or why you have you add new things to it. So what do you see about this?
No, that's a great point. And as an author, I face that often where, there's one study that found X. And people think there's a tendency of thinking we already know about it, nothing new, move on. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I think we do all share that bias as reviewers, authors, and editors. Mm-hmm. And I think the question then is, what makes it an important contribution to replicate or constructively replicate?
Well, I mean, because statistically you can always argue, hey, your sample is a convenient sample, right? So then it's not necessarily representative, and I'm not even talking about crossing different contexts. It's just even from the same population, it's a convenient sample. So right. That gives grounds for people to do an exact replication. However, exact replication may not be very efficient.
So let me give you one example. Recently, I was, I don't know, fourth or fifth author on a paper that got published in AMJ with John Matthew and his student, where one of the things we argued for is an interaction between, I think it was like unit level empowerment and psychological empowerment predicting job performance. And I had a previous paper in 2007 that found that interaction in a different way. So one of the things that we argued, and thankfully the AEs and reviewers at AMJ were open to that argument, was saying, look, this is a very different context, and because it's a different context, it's more complex, or sort of dynamic nursing kind of situation, we argued for a different form of interaction, okay? And now, now we have N of 2 that found interaction in different ways. We had sort of an explanation for why it's important to replicate it and why we would expect something different. And luckily, reviewers, I think what helped us is that context. The context was really important to replicate it in. Yeah. It wasn't an easy battle, but that's the kind of argument I think you have to make to replicate, right? So, on the other end of the spectrum, though, like in medicine, the question of should we do a direct replication, why it's important, especially when you're dealing with, like drugs or things that can really save lives, in a way it's easier to show why it's important. In our field, it's not always that easy nobody dies if you don't replicate. Very rarely do, you know what I mean? But it requires more thinking in terms of why is it that is important to look at that, okay? So that would be one way to think of it.
Yeah, well, not every study that publishes deserves or merits replication. This goes back to the point that Rich was making. I mean, what are the most important things that we really need to know? And we don't have a great deal of agreement on that at any of the particular levels of analyses that are represented in this conference. So having some targets around core phenomena that we really need to have clarity about would help a lot. Put some credibility around the effort invested in doing some kind of replication or constructive replications, which I agree are more likely to be found in our field, rather than anything is equally meritorious. That would help a lot on the journal side, it'd help a lot on the evaluating faculty side. And the other untapped, you know, if you want people to be replicating stuff, I don't know how many of you have master's level people trying to do theses, but a lot of times they don't have a clue what they want to do. And a lot of those things die anyway because it's not a great idea. And if they were just to do a constructive replication, you'd have a lot more raw material to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and I think a couple of other criteria that we can apply to this is, you know, obviously finding something important that begs more replication, that has real practical implication. I think that, you know, like the example from the job seeking, that would be an example where it's actually not, I mean, there's other job seeking kind of study that did focus more on self-efficacy and other things that have done experimental field experimentation. But that's one area where I think, you know, and Paul, I know you're very sympathetic to that as well, in terms of if you do large-scale field interventions, that's easier to convince people of the importance of replication. And it doesn't always replicate. I mean, we published a couple of papers of large-scale field intervention that a lot of findings were non-significant, but it was still important to show that, okay? So that's one. The other place where you see it more, it's more within study replication, is in those complex phenomena, like three-way interactions, okay? Or, you know, or just complex kind of, you know, especially if it can be done with relatively convenient samples, if you will. Where you see it less are the example of the expatriate studies. That's very hard to conduct studies like that and replicate, but a lot of time those studies in and of themselves have a replication component, okay? They replicate more basic research in a more complex phenomena. I have some other things to say about that later, but yeah. You know, the whole point, it's padded so you can toss it at each
Doesn't
other.
trust my ability to catch. Okay, so I agree that I think it's really good that you're making the point that replication attempts have to be of high quality. So they have to be highly powered, they have to be well designed. A lot of the OSF in their 2015 paper, it was such a big endeavor that they couldn't really do quality control very well. But there have been lots of other studies that I highlighted in my talk that I think are very high quality replications that failed to show. But my question here is, how do you do a constructive replication if the original effect is completely false, like always false? Because it seems to me the way you define a constructive replication is you're able to say it replicates under this condition, but not under this one. But if it never replicates, then you can't do a constructive replication because it's just not true, full stop.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points about it. First of all, there are different definitions of constructive replication out there. For me, constructive replication is any variation in either the sample or the, you know, measures or manipulations or anything like that, right? So even if you take, you know, and it could be a variety of that. But if the original study is wrong, well, I mean, there are examples like that, right? I mean, that's, and I'll talk about more on the reproducibility part, where I think that comments, allowing comments in our journal, I think that actually is an antidote for a lot of this. I think that that's a case where you could So Tammy just published a study that showed that something affects something else. You think she's wrong, and you do a series of studies to show that. But the example I've given from the escalation of commitment sort of did what you're questioning. It was an assumed effect that they suggested was wrong, and they did both a direct replication, the best they could. Then they did a highly powered direct replication. In both cases, they failed to replicate. But I think what made it more of a contribution, they didn't just show that something didn't work. They showed, or they didn't just show that one mechanism is wrong. They showed that an alternative mechanism is right. And I think that's a more powerful contribution in a sense that it doesn't just apply negativity, saying, Claudiana, you're just wrong on that. But it also shows when she might be right, when she might be wrong. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I'm worried that if that's the standard and if that's more likely to get published, now I'm incentivized to p-hack in order to get something. So basically, I have to show, I can show that the original finding is not true under the original conditions, but then I'm motivated in order to get this published. I have to then show.
So let me go back to it later, because one of the other suggestions I have later would speak more to that. Okay, which is about different journals. Okay, that's the other caveat, but I'll get to that later. All right, let me talk about reproducibility, and then I have a couple of more slides where I revisit suggestions, and we can talk about more question and solution then. All right. So reproducibility. So a couple of efforts. So this. So the I don't know how to pronounce that name. Nuchten et al. They basically developed this R program that kind of went fishing, literally, and look at sort of whether results were statistically correct or not. And they found that in about, so they looked at 8 psychology journals, including JP, finding 13% of inconsistency. About half of 30,000 studies had statistical errors, and in about 13% of the cases, the conclusion were wrong. Okay. Now there's those two folks, Daniel Lakens and Thomas Smith, and others. There's these blogs where they kind of went and they found some real problem with the R program. So this is again a case where somebody claimed that we're doing irreproducible science, and other people question the validity of their methods. Okay, PubPeer, that's another kind of effort. It's not meant to be anonymous, PubPeer. It's meant to be like it's just an open. You could go and post yourself and basically said, Jen, that study you did, I think had a mistake. Can we engage in that? Anyway. However, in our field, particularly in IOBHR, it was taken to be an anonymous platform. It was really I don't know who posted because it's anonymous, but they basically, in the last, I think it's quiet down a little bit, but there were like 2 or 3 years where they would basically contact primarily well-known researchers in our field, and it would almost be like a public shaming, anonymous shaming, saying, Paul, here's a list of studies that Paul Bleasy, he wasn't actually there because he does careful research.
Probably all true.
And you have a mistake here, and here in this such and such study. But there's no way to engage in discussion because they're anonymous. In fact, in a few cases, authors responded non-anonymously saying, if you let me know who you are, I'll send you the data so you could reproduce and see that I was actually right. But they went quiet. They went further. So as an editor for a while, I would get those emails that would be something like arrowinjp@gmail.com or something like that. And it would basically say the following paper was wrong that you published in that journal was wrong for the, And they would also, for a while, they went after interaction effects. And in that case, many times they were actually wrong. Those interaction effects were right, as verified by multiple authors. But there's no way to engage in a civil discussion because it was anonymous. And when I raised that issue to them once I finally responded and said, if you let me know who you are, we can discuss. They basically said, well, the COPE prevent me from, COPE is this, what is it? Code of, something like that. So there's a whistleblowing caveat there. Now, well, I'll say it later. That's not really what COPE suggests. That, and in fact, we've handled quite a few cases. Me as an author, as an editor, I've handled a few of those where somebody raise issues about an article, and oftentimes that leads to corrections. It even led to a retraction. Okay, so to say that you can, approach authors, but if you don't provide your name, then we don't know whether there's conflict of interest and all that. So anyway, those are efforts that I would put suggestive that there are reproducibility problem, but they're very hard to evaluate because they're anonymous, they have statistical errors and so forth. Moving forward, these are places. Jose Cortina is on the first one, and then they basically found mixed finding. We do, like in a mediation analysis, they actually, if you report correlation tables, you could kind of tell whether mediation is plausible. And they found that we do pretty well in terms of matching indirect effect to the pattern of correlations. But they're correct in saying that we're not often very good at distinguishing partial and full mediation. So that's one area that we have a caveat. The last two articles here basically noted some problems in terms of reporting of degrees of freedom and SEM kind of test, both in OBHR and then strategy. I don't doubt that in terms of reporting, we don't do enough to report well. For example, the example of interaction. It's still very rare to report the correlation and descriptive statistics with the product terms. And therefore, you cannot reproduce it unless you engage in those R programs that have a lot of problems in them. So that's something. But if you look at the main effect and the interaction and the plot, you can kind of tell whether they match. Okay? So there are ways for us to verify it, but we could do better on that. And then in terms of the CFAs and confirmative factor analysis, structural equation modeling, that's a case where I think that there are mistakes out there in terms of reported results, but they very, very rarely make a substantive difference. In very, very few of those cases that were highlighted in those papers would change the discussion section. Okay, so I would just point that out. All right, so just moving forward. So retractions. Leadership Quarterly, JEP had its first retraction. And the common theme there is that journals taking steps to do something about results that were wrong. Okay? I can tell you, and I have the scars to show for it, it's not easy. It is very, very hard to do retractions. But now I can go to those pop peer folks and say, I had an anonymous request that I've addressed, and if they're right, they're right. If they're not right, we tell. In most cases, people raise issues that are minute. So the response could be very easy, or it can be done with corrections. But in severe cases, it can lead to retractions. Okay? Commentary. So give Steve a lot of credit for putting a policy in place for JEP 2011 to handling comments and replies. And we published several of these under Steve's editorship and under my editorship. And that's a great way of enhancing rigor in the science because basically most of the comments are about, to your point, Joe, so it would be sort of, here's a problem we see in that study, and then you get the authors to reply. In this case, as Zigrel and Ryan and Nyan. So the original study was a meta-analysis, and they actually had a mistake in one of the tables, the table that summarized effect size from studies. They had a mistake. Fortunately for them, they did not have that mistake didn't translate to the meta-analysis was right. The description of studies were wrong. So it was a way to correct the record. And the two of them, to their credit, both the comment and reply, got into a very thoughtful exchange about basically file drawer problems in meta-analysis. So there was a way to sort of correct the record and move the field forward in terms of thinking about that. And there's other example, integrity testing and other kind of back and forth. I think that what that does, both retractions and commentaries, and then also APA came with this recent version of the journal article reporting standards. All of these together give us vehicles to report statistics more accurately, but they also create a a climate of accountability where we have a vehicle to hold authors accountable, but do it in a thoughtful way that moves things forward. Okay, so those are just some other thoughts. Just to summarize reproducibility, I do think we can do better as a field in terms of reporting statistics. Those of you in the room who work with me, JP, know that I spend a considerable amount of time working with AEs to address reporting. So every time there's an R&R JP, I skim it the best I can, and if I see that we don't ask for certain thing, I ping the AEs and we try to correct that. I'm mentioning that because all these solutions you see out there in terms of ways to address reproducibility and replication and so forth, at the end of the day, it's about reviewers and AEs and editors working to address those issues, and it is very time-consuming. We're dealing with, I think, Jason, you have, what, 1,600 submissions a year? We're at about 1,100 now. You multiply it with R&Rs. There's a lot of possibility for errors there, but I find that the most we can do is really create a climate where the editor and the associate editors discuss issues and we try to address it. But then at the end of the day, if it slips through the crack and get published and something is wrong, we have corrections, common replies, and when need to, retractions. I think that's the way science should work, but we can't expect everything to be caught, at that point. Let's see. I don't think there's widespread evidence for a problem of reproducibility in our field. I think that happens occasionally, but I think that the evidence is more mixed on that. I think you can find your examples and highlight them, but I doubt it that that's a major problem in our field. In part because we don't know. We don't know how much of a problem that is, but that's something that I think as a field we paying more attention to and doing better and better in. Any other thoughts on reproducibility before I move on? All right, let me go over some summary and suggestions, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about ways to move the field forward on that. Okay, so in terms of replication, I really think it begins with, so one of the things I would say I like the most about this conference and the whole exchange that we see in our field on that is it kind of moved the needle. I think that in looking back at our science, and I reflect particularly on IO psychology, okay? So it started as a very practical field, and if you look at the early 1900s, when it all started until really the 50s and 60s, it was really about applying psychological principle to help organization with practical problem. So it started with very much being a very rigorous science, focusing on practical problem. But then somewhere in there in the 60s and 70s, we start realizing that we're doing a little bit of dust bowl empiricism, and we start caring more about theory. And that's when you also start seeing that in sociology and economics and other places where theory start being more critical. I do think that somewhere along the way we became a little too, too theory fetish in a way. I mean, we became a little too, we move a little too much to the side of theoretical novelty. And what we see now with the open science movement is a push back to rigor, which I think is a positive shift. It's not that we're going to be dust bowl empiricists, but I think that it's a nice shift to see. And I think that's a good thing. But I think that goes to sort of what do we appreciate, so not every replication should be published. Okay, so there could be different journals that maybe publish, so a little bit of the experimentation that JPSP and Journal of Experimental Psych are doing, where they publish online version of replications. That could be one solution. There could be other journals that do that. But you're not going to change the mission of journals like AMJ, JP, PSych, OBGP by, basically saying you're just about reproducibility and replication, because we also need to move the knowledge forward. So it's somewhere in between there, between different journals, different sections of journal, there may be a solution. Transparency of method and reporting, I think, is really critical. That's a starting point for any replication. If you don't know what's been done, you can't replicate. And that's something that I think you see improvement on. Let's see. Research reports. I think that I've seen many cases where studies that I would consider more on the constructive replication side end up getting published as research report at JP, but probably would have been rejected otherwise. It's not always like that. And we publish research reports that don't do replications. We publish feature articles that do replications. So it depends how you look at it. But at least it gives you a portfolio of magnitude of contribution. So JP, we have research report, feature article, monographs, and then comments. So we have a portfolio approach. And I think that gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you address those issues. It's not a perfect solution, but it gives you a little more output there. Other journals, you wouldn't see that for a variety of reasons, but maybe we have other journals that come up that do more replication and so forth. So those are all some thoughts I have. Other thoughts in terms of improving replications, if you will. I don't know, Joy, if I answered your question yet completely, but any other thoughts on that? Steve, you can't see it on the football.
And this is kind of to Joe's thing, and this is going to be something that would be true in, say, social psychology, or maybe the kind of work that I do is more lab-based, where what often the idea is what you're doing with a constructive is saying, so here's this finding. I bet it might not generalize to this. I bet there's a moderator, and so you do this study where you have one condition is the exact replication, and then another condition is the other level of the variable. Now, suppose what happens is that first cell doesn't replicate. And social psychologists said, yeah, this happens all the time, and this is one of the reasons they got to this crisis issue. Well, to me, the answer to that is, okay, now you're going to design your next study, which is going to be focused on alternative explanations for why you're not finding an explanation. So one of the main reasons we don't get non-significant results published is because we didn't focus on the alternative explanations for the null result. If we focus on that, then there's fewer things that the reviewers can come back and say, oh, but you got a null because of X, Y, and Z. So you go to replicate, you go to essentially now saying, I'm now thinking that original thing isn't really true. I'm going to do study one showed me that it turned out it didn't work out here. I'm going to do study two, try to show it's not true. Do study two, one of two things could happen. It could come out not replicated, and then you're on to something, and you're on to a sexy thing for the replicators, right? It's like, oh, here's 4 studies that couldn't replicate this. And that's a publishable paper, certainly now in JPSP. And I think
so a couple of thoughts, and I don't know, there are a lot of issues you raised, so let me just address a couple of things. So first, in terms of JPSP, it's funny. The editors there reconsider whether to keep it up or not. So one of the issues they're facing, and it's because of the nature of the journal and the studies they publish here, is that it's very, very hard for them to separate the regular articles from the replication studies, because they all do this, multi-study, and reviewers and editors that really struggle with the contribution issue. And what's the difference between a replication section study versus a regular article? So that's one of the things they struggle with. The other thing you mentioned about, and that's something that I didn't mention on the slide, but I should raise. I think there is an assumption out there that significant results are more likely to be published. Maybe. I can't tell you how many papers I've seen rejected. I've seen, as an editor of JP, I've seen, I think, over 4,000 papers. And if you add associate editor, I don't know, it's probably like, I don't know, over 5,000 papers by now. I have seen, I don't have a number, but it's a significant portion of studies that get rejected where everything is supported. And I also have examples of papers that a lot of things didn't get supported. Now, it's very hard to study it explicitly, but I think that it's a misnomer that just because you found a significant effect, that would get you published or not published.
I agree with that, actually.
The other thing I would say is that if I was to do like a Venn diagram of what accounts for R&Rs, I would say I wouldn't put more than 20 to 30% of the chances of succeeding and getting an R&R, whether things were supported or not. I think that much greater variance, probably close to 50% plus, is whether you're addressing an important issue. That important issue can be an issue of replicating something that we've seen in lab with a nice field intervention, because here is sort of, or whatnot. But I think that accounts for more. And one of the downside of the open science movement, I think, is that it overblow the importance of significant tests relative to the broad portfolio of what reviewers and editors pay attention to. I think it's important, and it certainly is a non-trivial portion, but I think it's blown a little out of proportion. That's one of the things that I think, and it's very, I actually try to help Jose Cortina get access to. He wanted to do a study that verify what I just said. For legal reasons, we can't release papers for him to do that. So that's maybe APS can do that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I actually wasn't quite done with my comment.
Okay.
Because what could also happen, and that's basically the question is to Joe. What could also happen is you do that second study and you do replicate it, and then you got to go, okay, what's making the difference? And you do the third study to try to find the moderator, and maybe you'll get at the end a clean answer, and maybe you won't. And if you don't even try to get it published. And if you do, you try to get it published.
I see.
And so that's the game. Does that seem like a reasonable game? I'm going to throw it back. Oh, you got one.
Yeah, so I think that's a reasonable game. It's just that you don't have control over whether the original effect is ever true or not. So, I mean, I've just done this game with a student of mine where we got the original materials from a study in JPSP. The original materials differed from what they described happened during their study. So then we were like, maybe the moderator is whether they did the study the way they reported or the study the way they did it. And we were excited to find that because we wanted to find that as a moderator. We ran the study, nothing happens ever. And then we ran the study again. They did it on MTurk, we did it on MTurk. They had 100 per cell, we had 300 per cell. It does not happen. It is untrue. I think the policy should be that this paper was published in JPSP. I think the editors of JPSP have a responsibility that if we submit this paper for publication, and if we demonstrate that our replication is highly powered and well designed and well done, after the authors serve as reviewers and they have a chance to give their 2 cents, I think they have an obligation to publish failures to replicate of the stuff that's published in their own journals. Otherwise, these findings will never be corrected. I should say, I say that with the fact being that we are not going to submit it to a journal, because I don't want my graduate student to make enemies before he gets a job.
So I have a similar kind of, so I teach a method overview for all our PhD students in both strategy and OBHR, and I picked an article that seemed like something would be very easy to do a direct replication, like an MTurk kind of study. I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years now. Nobody ever replicates it. And when I looked at the original article, it didn't make sense to me. There's some flaws in it. Now, I don't want my students to start their career by trying to publish it. But I do think that having like a comment and reply section allows you to do that. Unfortunately, that journal does not have that. There's another journal. I have a colleague from strategy who actually found something wrong in another journal there, and that journal doesn't have that out. So I think that's where, if that journal had a comment reply thing, I would probably consider it, because I agree with you. That's something that should be done. Now, I would never look at, I like what Rich mentioned in terms of, it's not that the original effect is true or not true. It's evidence that is refutable. And then you accumulate evidence and you find whether that evidence is, we keep finding the same thing or not, but I never look at it as true, not true. I don't think it's ever as simple as that, but that's just maybe a language kind of thing. But I do think that as a culture, it would be very helpful to do what you suggested, right? But I think that the alternative to that would be, and that's something I might consider doing in that case, is write an article that more like the Thomas Schultz kind of article on escalation of commitment that explain why it didn't replicate and show when what might actually operates as something that works. I think that would make more of a contribution, but there could be more of a comment kind of section for what you propose. Right. Let me just talk about reproducibility a little more. Yeah, so that's where I have a little more concrete thing in terms of culture of statistical reporting. So simple things like, so we have a lot of those mediated moderation kind of finding in our field now, right? A mediated moderated model of your choice of topics. At the very least requires that authors report correlation table before they go into model 9 or 11 or 12 in that, what is that, SAS macro, Hayes model. Yeah, before you show all those process results, show us the regression table or HLM, whatever, so that by the time we get to the complex, the simple lead us to understand the complex. Especially with mediation, it's very easy to do tests of indirect effect are overly powerful, for example. Okay? If you don't have the correlation table and the regression, it's very hard to verify that. Stuff like that. Or report statistics in regression, HLM, SEM, whatnot. If you report the unstandardized estimate and the standard error, I can verify your t-value. Okay? So that's a very simple form of verification. You'd be surprised. I've been asking that since being associate editor. I've always asked authors to report that. I've seen quite a few mistakes where people had a star next to an effect that when you report the B-weight standard error, they don't find that. Okay, but that's a kind of reporting. These are things that are very simple. You have no idea how much time I spend as an editor working with AEs to do that. It takes time and to build that, but I do that. Encourage data sharing. That's a really, really tricky issue. So we actually, I'm about to publish an editorial at JAP. It'll come through the nets when APA finishes the production. But one of the things that we added there is now APA partner with the Open Science Framework, so you could do a pre-registered report, you could share data, and so forth. We don't require it, though. And the reason we don't require it, it's really complicated in our field. So, if you look at some of the work Paul has done, with the military, or that Steve is doing now with NASA and the like, these are really sensitive data, okay? To be able to share everything is very, very hard. But if you report a correlation table, you already share some of the data, okay, that allow reproducibility. Now, if you share the data the raw data that allow reproduction of results, that's sharing data, but it doesn't share the whole. You're not giving the whole farm out in terms of people using that. Okay, so you see movement on that. I'm very much in favor of doing that, but I don't want us to miss on cases where people have really important findings that for whatever reason they cannot share the data. Okay, so there's a balance act there. And that's in line. I'm not saying anything that is not within APA policy. APA policy has that caveat that, yes, you should share your data unless there are legal or other reasons not to do that. Okay? So that's something that I think would help to do more, and you will see it more and more, not just in the APS journal, but also in our field. But in our field, I think there are a lot of sensitive data out there. The data transparency stuff that JP is doing, okay? All of those kind of things, you see movement there, but it's a process that we as a field need to struggle with a little bit so we do it right and we don't rush into it in a way that could harm us in some ways. Paul?
Gilad, I was just going to say, it turns out, as you alluded to be very easy just to take someone's mean standard deviations and correlation table to reproduce their data, right? As long as you're only dealing with the main effects, right? So 2 concrete things that might be done. One you talked about a little bit, but just require that they put the cross product in the correlation table, because you can't use that same technique to uncover the correlation. You have to have that. That would help. And the other one would be just potentially to think about requiring that they put 3 decimal places on some of the correlations. Because when I've done this in the past, sometimes to get their results, you have to go back to their correlation table, because in fact that half of a point that might have rounded it up or down
Right.
actually causes you to be unable to replicate their things. These are, I mean, what does it matter if you put one more
Yeah,
decimal place
so
in? and,
I'm just
you know,
thinking of the amount of work I'm already doing with simple. I'll leave that to the next editor to do. But I agree with you. I mean, those are good suggestions. Now, the reason I'm not focusing too much on that interaction term correlation per se is that if you know the main effect and you see the interaction and the interaction term, you could kind of tell whether it's in the right direction or not. Not everybody can, but no, that's something that we should certainly think about. Those are good suggestions. So I think I'm about out of time, but I think that the overall message here that I want to leave you with is I don't think there's one silver bullet that makes a difference here. I think it's really, it does take a village in terms of ideas and discussions. I think there are multiple aspects that need to be considered, but I hope that I shared some ideas that could be helpful. So thank you, I appreciate it.